Hi everybody, you're all very welcome here at the Queen's University Belfast. On behalf of the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics, bit of a mouthful, you're all very welcome. I'm John Barry, and together with Join the Dots, I'm hosting today's event, and we're delighted to have you all here this morning to talk about important issues. You know, the issue we're going to be discussing, the planetary crisis, justice, issues of the intersectionality of that with issues of gender, racism, colonialism, and so on, they all may come up. But this is more than just an intellectual issue or something that you're going to do in your A-levels or at university, although you can do that as well. My day job here is to corrupt the minds of the young, otherwise known as teach. So there is a role for education. But actually, the importance of the topic we're discussing today is going to be the parameters of your lives in the decades ahead. I mean, the planetary crisis is going to be the condition under which we all live, the careers you choose, where you go and live, buy a house, change jobs. These are really important issues which we're only beginning to get a full understanding of. That's why we're delighted to have Martin Palmer here today to talk about those deep ethical issues that underpin this. And we're conscious, and I'm certainly conscious as an educator, that the lives of young people today are so stressful. There's so much pressure on you. And I think it's rather arrogant and patronizing for my generation, the older generation, to say, oh, we're so inspired by the Greta Thunberg generation. You're going to take care of the climate crisis. I think that's unfair to you. The other thing I would say before I hand over to Anne-Marie Duffy, who'll talk through the format of today, is that the crisis we're facing is not just an ethical crisis or one of science and our overuse of fossil fuels or our overuse of Shein. Please do not buy anything from that company. Really, really bad. And promise me this, please don't read beauty magazines. They only make you feel ugly. That's the whole point of that social media. But the crisis we're facing, and why it's so great to have young people, or young adults in the room, is also it's a crisis of voice and democracy. I'm a passionate believer in votes at 16. I think young people at the age of 16 can make informed choices about politics, but also your voice actually matters. And as you'll see, and we hope to achieve in today's event, we want to flip the tables in terms of you sitting there as passive, receiving the pearls of wisdom from my lips, that somehow you're going to see a collection of sages on the stage telling you what to do. And we will have politicians coming in, so be nice to them. They're not all bad. But to flip the relationship between yourselves and politicians, and even people like me, supposed experts, we're all in this together. And that actually part of the problem we face is not just a crisis of voice and democracy, but a crisis of imagination. We seem to be stuck in kind of a loop of what's possible. And that's why we do need creativity. You know, art has as much a role to play as science. You know, some of you sadly only get your second choice and come here to Queen's, and I'm teaching you here in a philosophy class. I'll be talking about Plato. Plato's an old dead white guy from the Greek ages. Many people think philosophy is a footnote to Plato. It's probably an exaggeration. But Plato was not a democrat. If you read his famous book called The Republic, I don't know whether Jerry Adams has ever read it, but it's a different form of republicanism. But in his famous book, The Republic, about the ideal society, he banishes the poets. And the reason being is that you cannot control that artistic, creative, imaginative element. And that's what we want to try and give you a taste of today. There's no stupid question. There's no crazy idea. Part of our problem is that we're self-policing what we think we can say, and we understand that there's social pressure, there's group dynamics and so on. So please, particularly if you don't want to feel comfortable saying it in your group or out loud, write it down in terms of some of the issues that we're discussing. Because the reality is education, as William Butler Yeats said, it's not the filling of an empty bucket. You know, I think too often, including myself, we often view education, you come to us as blank sheets or empty buckets and we're going to fill you with knowledge. Yeats said it's the lighting of a fire. It's actually trying to give you the tools that you can come up with your own ideas. So please be imaginative, be bold, be kind. Very important to be kind to each other. And I hope you enjoy the day. And particularly for the teachers in the audience, I'm more than happy, together with other colleagues who've helped organise this and joined the DOS, to do future events I mean, this university has enormous resources. This is not a particularly nice room, but it's an okay room. But if you contact me, we can organise more of these type of events. And I think it's a part of our duty of service to our local community. We are in a crisis. It is a planetary emergency. So let's act as if it is. And that includes to ourselves in the university to start moving outside our own business as usual thinking. You'll hear more from me, sadly, later on, but I'm going to hand over now to Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie, you're all very welcome.
Thank you, John. I'm just aware that some people might feel a bit uncomfortable. You're sort of sitting in line, so move your chairs out away from the desk so that you're sitting front on. You don't have to sit sideways. Just move your chairs so you feel comfortable. Move out into the spaces. The tables are really only there for a session that we're going to have at 11 o'clock. So feel free, just move out and feel comfortable so that you can see each other. So the most important thing about today is actually you young people today. So I am going to actually, I have this on screen in the environmental aspect. So I'm going to call out your schools. Now I want you to stand up because I want the people in the room, the adults, and he's Professor John Barry, by the way, here from Queen's University. Very important person in climate action campaigns. And we have Martin Palmer, who doesn't use his professor title, but Martin Palmer is down here. He's another very important person. But you are the most important people in this room. And the greatest part of today has been given to you to speak, not to professors, not to politicians, but to you. Because you are the people that have the ideas. You are the people we hope will come through with the creativity that we need to, if not at least solve this crisis, to try and manage this crisis as best we can. So today is the second day in a number of days that we're having around exploring climate justice, peace, and also exploring faiths and faiths coming together and what great things faiths working together can do. And it's great to see you all here today. I am not going to introduce the speakers. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But just to give you a quick run of the events, Martin Palmer will speak for 20 minutes, and then you'll have an opportunity just in a buzz group for about 10 or 15 minutes. What's your main takeaway, or what from his talk excited you, interested you, worried you? It doesn't really matter what it is. It's just a chance for you to react to that. We may call on those, we may not. Then we will have John Barry. Professor John Barry will speak with Martin here about some of the things that Martin has raised and tease some of those issues out from his perspective and a more local perspective. Then we'll have another quick buzz group. And then at 11 o'clock, we're going to organise you so that you can meet different people from different schools, because you're all here together with the one interest. So why not meet people from different schools with the same interest? And we're going to ask you maybe to come up with one proposal that you think would work in some aspect of helping us to do something about this crisis, and then to think about one question for the politicians. And there are flip charts in front of you to write on at that stage. Then we will display all your questions around the room and your proposals, and then each of you will put a tick beside which one you think is the most important so that we can get it in first. And hopefully we will have time for all the others. Politicians will arrive at 12 o'clock. We have 3 politicians coming. We did contact all the political groups, but we had a return from 3, and I followed them up 4 or 5 times. So we will need to decide at the end of today, how do we make our voices heard to those 5 parties who did not send representatives? And we will follow them through, and we will see what suggestions you come up with to do that. And that's basically it. So I am going now to hand over to Martin Palmer. And Martin will introduce himself. And I wish you a very productive morning, interesting, and hopefully you will make many new friends. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Anne-Marie. And good morning, and really nice to be here. And by the way, I was at an amazing place, Corrymeela, yesterday, and the weather was fantastic. And I was told it's always sunny here and it never rains, and you're all praying for rain. I believe that's true? No, perhaps not, perhaps not. Anyway, it is a delight to be here. So My name is Martin Palmer. I have been religious advisor to His Royal Highness Prince Philip on the environment, which for 35 years, until he died actually, which was quite demanding, quite challenging. I have compared it to being etiquette advisor to Attila the Hun, but the meals were very good, so it had its compensations. But I've also headed, I helped him organize the first ever meeting. He was the president of WWF International, and in 1985, he asked me to organize the first ever meeting between all the major faiths. Well, they were all the major faiths he could remember, which was Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and Islam, and all the major environmental groups around the world, not just WWF, but Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, Nature Conservancy, etc. And we held this meeting in Assisi, and it was the first time ever that the faiths had been asked to say what they actually thought about nature, about the environment. Prior to that, they'd really never given it much thought, to be absolutely honest. In fact, he asked me to go around the world before we did the Assisi event to just find out what the faiths were doing. What were they actually doing on the environment? And I'll come to it later. To a certain extent, where you have a sacred place, like a churchyard or a mosque or a sacred mountain, the environment was better protected simply because you don't tend to plow up where you bury granny or spray it with chemical fertilizer and so forth. So these habitats were more pristine. We did a big survey of the sacred mountains of China, for example, and where the monks, Buddhists and Taoists, were still on the mountains, the biodiversity there was infinitely better than where it had been, where they'd been removed. So there was sort of incidental environmental protection because places were sacred. But there were only 3 actual programs by a faith directed, or by using faith, directed to tackle environmental crisis. One was a Buddhist program, basically in Thailand and with Tibetan Buddhist communities in India. One was a very new one called Arosha, which was in Portugal, and this was a Christian evangelical community who wanted to bring people into the countryside to reconnect them with nature. And the third one was a work that I'd done with WWF, which was creating the first ever RE book on environmental education and faith called Worlds of Difference. That was it. Now there's 1.5 million religious environmental projects around the world, according to the UN. So it's been quite an interesting journey, to put it mildly. And I just want to share a few things from that journey, in a way. And I suppose the first thing I want to say is that it would never have happened, this whole religion and environment thing, if somebody hadn't decided to do something that everybody thought was ridiculous. So when we announced we were going to hold this event at Assisi with the major faiths, every single environmental group said, why? What relevance are they? And anyway, we're scientific, and they're not. They're superstitions and things like this. And if it hadn't been for the courage of Prince Philip to say, do you know, I still think we should meet, you might learn something. So I think part of exactly what Anne-Marie's just said this morning, traditionally at an event like this, you would be asked, what questions do you have for us? And there'll be a session of that for John and myself. The far more important is, what would you imagine could happen if you brought together groups that don't normally meet? And if you challenged assumptions that aren't normally challenged? And I'm going to start with one, which is that I've worked with every major environmental group, and with the UN and all sorts of groups, and they love data and information. They love it. Look at the reports that come out. Huge documents designed not to be read. That's what they're there for. They're not to be read because, frankly, they're so monumentally dull and incomprehensible. But we've based all our policies on the assumption that everybody has read them. So there is this fixation with data. Now, we need to know what is happening. But far more importantly, we need to know why it is happening, not just that it's happening, and we need to know what we could do that would be different. And I'll tell you a story about this, because I have a very strong feeling that, well, I would challenge anybody to counter this. I don't think anybody's ever been converted by a pie chart. It just isn't how it grips you. We're changed by stories. We are a narrative species. So I've met many of your teachers here today. Have I got any data from them? No, I don't know how old any of them are. I don't know how much they weigh. I don't know how many calories they had for breakfast, but I have had some wonderful conversations about friends that we have in common, things that they've done and places they visited. In other words, I've got to know these people. I'm beginning to do so because of stories, not because I got a list of information that gives me anything other than data. That's not relevant in our relationships. And a few years ago, I brought an Assistant Secretary General of the UN to a meeting with 1,000 Taoist monks and nuns in China. And he was one of the people mostly concerned with preparing for the Paris COP in 2015 on climate change. And he's a lovely man, Norwegian, lovely man. But he has to give all the sort of data. And so he spoke to these Taoist monks and nuns for about 45 minutes, and we had all kinds of charts on the wall and stuff and all the rest of it. And I was watching, I'm a China specialist, and I was watching my Taoist friends, and it was clear that this was just kind of going like this. And then he stopped, and this elderly, wonderful, old Taoist master, old Master Ren, he was in his 90s, and he looked like your sort of archetypal image of a sort of Chinese sage, scraggly beard and amazing top knot and the whole thing. And he stood up, and in Chinese he said, well, I think that was quite interesting. But I think what he was trying to say is this, and this was about climate change. He said what he was basically saying is this, and you may know in Chinese philosophy you have yin and you have yang. And yin is the heavens, it's the sun, it's heat, it's male. And yin is the moon, it's the earth, it's water, it's female. And they're not in opposition. There's this myth that the yin-yang symbol is a symbol of harmony. No, it's not. They would rip each other apart if they possibly could. But they have the seed of each other within them. And that means they have to keep some kind of balance. And he said, what he was trying to say is this. Fossil fuels are yin. They should be in the earth. But we've been burning them, so they've become yang. And they've gone up into the heavens, and they've completely screwed up the balance. So our job is very simple. We have to keep that stuff in the ground, and we have to restore the balance of nature, because it is causing nature, not us, nature, horrendous problems. Now, that was a narrative version, and you could see all these Taoist monks nodding away. We now have solar panels on every single Buddhist and Taoist temple in China as a result. They run education programs. They take young people out into the countryside. And when I say take young people out into the countryside, there's one particular sacred mountain where 250,000 young people come every other weekend. And the Taoists run programs there. So their focus was on a balance. And it was not on data, although the data had made them aware of how important it was to restore that balance and how important it was to find a language that worked. And just this year, in February, the Muslim communities around the world produced the first ever joint document on the environment called Al Meban. And Al Meban is one of the names of God, one of the 99 names of God, and it means the balance. And the whole focus within Al Meban, and we've been working with Muslim communities now for 30 years. There are many eco-mosques now, And there is also, and I'll come to that in a moment, there is also a whole program on Islamic finance. As you know, Islam does not charge interest. And it also has the whole system of paying zakat, which is the tax that is paid on your disposable income every year, which produces billions and billions of dollars in the Muslim world. And we're now working for that to go into green environmental funds, or into environmental funds, rather than just be held. But that notion within Islam that there needs to be a balance. And in Islamic teaching, we're not the purpose at all. We're not the purpose. And in fact, in traditional Islamic thought, this is not our planet. The fall was from another planet, and we're here on probation. We're here on trial. And if we succeed in having a balanced relationship with the rest of creation, and Islam is very strong on this whole focus. There's a wonderful story, or two stories actually, of the Prophet Muhammad. One is when it comes time for prayer in the evening, and in Islam you have wudu, which is the ritual washing, and he's by a river, and he has his followers with him, and they're all getting ready to go into the river, and he goes to the edge of the river, and he gets a little bowl, and he scoops up a little bowl of water, and he does the ritual washing with this little bowl of water. And his friends, his disciples go, "What are you doing? It's the whole river." And he goes, "But that's all I need. That's all I need." And then the second one is that he's walking with his disciples, and they're young people, and they start teasing a mother bird and her chicks, and he absolutely blows a gasket. He rages at them. And when one of them goes, "But they're only birds," he says, "That is a mother. Would you do this to your mother?" So there's that intensity of relationship, that we're not here for us. We're here to fulfill a greater purpose and to be part of a greater picture. And then we come to something like Laudato Si. Now, I have to, and I do realize there's an awful lot of Catholics here. I'm an Anglican, which is a very comfortable position because A, nobody ever asks us what we believe. B, we have no idea what we believe. And C, it's just not done to ask us what we believe. So please don't. However, Catholics are a little bit more sure, as are indeed some of the Protestant traditions, I would have to say. And what I think is so fascinating is that the very first group of Christians who took up the environmental message were the Orthodox churches. These are the churches in Russia and Bulgaria and Romania and Greece and so forth. And there was a claim at the time that Christianity was, and Judaism, was actually the root of our abuse of nature. Because there are certain texts and certain interpretations of certain texts which make it sound as though everything is here for us, as though we are the whole reason for creation. But the Orthodox Church took a completely different approach. They said, we are here to be like the priests of creation. We are here simply to be the channel by which God's grace and blessing comes to the whole of nature, and nature's thanks and praise is given back to God. In other words, we're just a conduit for God's grace. We are not the purpose. But then the other churches began to come on beam, and the Protestant churches in particular started making statements. There are over 700 faith-based statements by the major religions around the world on the environment. And Laudato Si was late to the ball. The Orthodox Church published their response to the environmental crisis in 1989. There was nothing of any significance other than a few tiny little niblets from the Catholic Church until Laudato Si in 2015. But then that cracked open the church. And what's the heart of that? The heart of that is the notion of ecological conversion. Why do you need to convert? You need to convert because you're going down the wrong path. And the heart of Laudate Si is a restoration of relationships because they're broken. They're tragically broken. They're abused. They're distorted. They're warped. And I'll give you a little example of, so we have now, Prince Philip and I set up a thing called the Alliance of Religions and Conservation in 1995. And we had two tasks. One was to get all the major religions to come up with environmental statements based on their own beliefs and teachings. Second one was to get the secular world to take working with the faiths seriously. And so we worked with the World Bank and the UN and all kinds of different slightly odd organizations. But it sort of worked. And then we decided we would give it a short lifespan. We'd seen too many groups coming into being and then going on being in order to go on being. So we gave ourselves a 20-year lifespan on the basis that if we'd succeeded by then, we should shut. And if we hadn't succeeded, we were obviously a disaster and we should shut anyway. So one way or another, we were going to close. But through that process, we began to appreciate, and we did the first ever audit of what the faiths actually owned, managed, looked after around the world. And to take one example, in sub-Saharan Africa, according to UNICEF, 65% of all schools are faith-based, Christian, Muslim, Hindu. Around about 10% of the habitable surface of the planet is owned or managed by faiths. So, for example, in Cambodia, before the Khmer Rouge and the collapse of Cambodia in the 70s and 80s, the Buddhists owned 40% of Cambodia. They now have about 15% back. But they are the groups that have protected the forests. They are the monks that patrol the forests and undertake the research to make sure it's okay. But the heart of all this is just about relationships. And there's a story I want to share, which I found terribly moving at the time. So the faiths own about 5% of all the commercial forests in the world. And commercial forestry is one of the real break points for the protection of the planet, because the ruthless exploitation of them doesn't just destroy the forest, it destroys the soil, it destroys the water sources, and so forth. And we had a big meeting of the faith forest owners, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, and Shinto. And at one point, one of the Christian groups was getting very excited because they had already declared their forests, which are in Lebanon, as sacred forests, protected forests by the Maronite Church, protected by them. And they said, why don't we just make all our forests faith-protected forests? And everyone kind of went, whoa, yeah, that's a great idea. Except for the Shinto, who kind of went, I went, sorry, what is the problem? And they said, but this is nonsense. So I said, please explain. They said, we don't protect the forests. They protect us. So just in the language we use sometimes, we assert a right to possess. We have to get rid of that because we don't. We don't possess the rivers. We don't possess the sky. They're there for the whole of creation, evolution, call it what you want. And I've worked for many, many years with all these big international organizations. At the moment, we've just done a deal. I now head a thing called FaithInvest, which is working with the religions on their investment portfolios, which we are moving away, not just moving out of investing in fossil fuels, which is fine, but frankly, fairly pointless, because somebody else just buys the shares. The question is, what do you do with the money you've shifted? Are you investing in alternative energy so we don't have to go back to fossil fuels? Or do you feel you've done enough by being kind of deeply spiritual and all the rest of it, which is important, but frankly, it doesn't change the system. It just means somebody who has less care takes up those shares. We have to be funding the alternatives. And we have to be doing it in a way that becomes affordable for ordinary people, not just for the wealthy. So we're working with a group called the Green Climate Fund. Now, this was set up after Paris in 2015. Its job is to move money from the developed world to the developing world. It manages $30 billion a year. Its problem is it has absolutely no idea what it's doing. It has no contact with real people. It works solely with governments. And as the head of it, who's a very beloved friend of mine, Mafalda Duarte, said, I meet with governments, I meet with presidents and prime ministers, most of whom were never elected. They're just there because they're nastier than anybody else. And they have absolutely no idea what's going on, but I'm expected to put billions of dollars into investments to develop a green economy or to develop sustainable, or whatever it is. So realizing quite early on in her time in this organization that really they had no idea and the people they were dealing with had no idea. Yes, they had the scientists and the specialists, but they just told you what was going on, not why, and not what you should do to change it, really. So they came to us, to the faiths, and said, you're on the ground. You have a huge diversity of views, because I haven't the slightest interest in what unites the faiths. I've been at interfaith events, and they are the most boring on God's earth, because it's all about God. I want faiths to be meeting with the secular world and saying, this is how we can address a real problem. So we've been asked to bring in the faiths, but we've also been asked to bring in the arts, exactly what John was saying earlier. We need the arts. We need the faiths because we tell stories. We depict what is going on. We explore how to express it. And that is what the Green Climate Fund, one of the largest international bodies dealing with climate change, has decided to do. So every country they go to which asks for an investment from them, this is not charity, this is investment, we now do a ground survey. We get the faiths to report. So an example would be Nicaragua. The government there had a grand scheme for building a dam. Through the Catholic Church, the indigenous communities were able to say, this is not what we asked for. We've never been consulted. And so the Green Climate Fund withdrew their investment. So I want to leave you at this point with the fact that, frankly, and I've worked with every major international institution, I've met maybe a handful of people who actually know what's going on. And of that handful, a few who realize that what we cannot do is continue with what we've always had. So I'd love to hear from you what you think should be done. Because frankly, we need to hear different pictures, different visions. So I look forward to you being really radical, really thoughtful, and know that some of us here can take that to people who want to hear. So thank you.
Thank you, Martin. So now you're going to go into a quick kind of buzz group for 10 minutes, your reactions to what Martin has said, and then I'll be in conversation with him. I should have said we're not expecting a fire alarm test, so if there is one, make your way out through the exits and over to the War Memorial, and also toilets are just here behind me. So for about 10 minutes there, and please jot down your thoughts, words, ideas. That's great. So we're going to move into now myself in conversation with Martin, but before that, is there any question any group would like to ask Martin, or proposal or reaction to what you've heard?
We should stand, I think, otherwise we can't see.
Yes. So anybody like to? Yes, I'll go to you and then yourself.
So with regard to the relevance of objective truth, and in a world filled with different religious narratives, do you not think that using narratives as a tool to convince is the best course of action? Considering how different and polarized their worldviews are, is objective, empirical truth not the only common ground that they can find?
My problem with the notion of empirical objective views is that it doesn't actually exist. We all live within stories. So I'll give you a very simple example. The presumption of narrative truth is that time is linear. Only half the world believes time is linear. The other half sees it as cyclical. There is also the problem of the fact that the way we explain evolution is completely shaped by the book of Genesis. It's linear, it has a beginning, it has a middle, it has a rollout, and it's only ever happened once. In Hindu and Buddhist and Taoist belief, this era we're living in, this aeon, is one of 100,000 aeons. The universe has been through this time and time again. The universe is a modern fiction of something that they believe has happened more times than there are grains of sand on the banks of the river Ganges. So we live in a world that we've constructed to fit with what we think is good. There's a classic tale in Taoism, in the Taoist religion, of the frog in the well. And there's a frog in the well, and the frog is in the well, he's in his water, he's very happy, and he looks up and he can see the sky. So that's the universe, that's it. Then there's a flood, and the frog gets washed out of the well and gets washed into a stream, and suddenly there's this stream. God, it moves, and it's almost as wide as these tables. And the sky, whoa. And then he gets washed down into the ocean, and by this point his brain is completely pickled, because what he thought was water turns out to be something so incomprehensibly vast. We're the frog in the well on the whole. Also, when we've tried to apply what we thought was truth, whether that was Christianity, whether that was Marxism, whether that was capitalism, whether that was democracy, colonialism, when we thought this is it, it never was. It never was unifying, because we're pluralist. You're all very different here. Thank God for that. And if I was to bring in some of the groups we work with, particularly indigenous peoples and so forth, radically different in how we behave. The problem has been that from the West, we want everything to be one. We want everybody to agree. And if they don't agree, then you call them heretics. And you burn them, or you imprison them, or you throw them away. We should be able to live with diversity. Now, the trouble is that in the West, we think that difference must mean that there is the truth and then there is the not truth. Diversity actually recognizes that we all come at the same thing from very different angles and for very different reasons. And if we can't build on diversity, we will constantly be suppressing some group because they don't agree with us. Diversity gives you the ability to listen. So when we did this big event in Assisi in '86, and this is nothing like this had ever been done before, Prince Philip and I sat down to work out how we would invite people. We were having 5 major religions come. We were having a huge range of environmental groups, some of whom were only concerned about preserving rural America, some of whom were deeply embedded into colonialism, like the environmental groups coming out of South Africa who were all white. And so we decided we would come up with a phrase, and it was, "Come proud of your own tradition, but humble enough to listen." That, for me, is the future.
What is the top priority for tackling climate change? And as you were saying, with a lot of the money that's raised, it's well enough having that money, but what do you think the main issue is, and how are you going to put that money to good use?
Money is only a fraction of the problem, because what you fund depends on what people have asked there to be funding for. So the big question is, what is actually really needed? Because money, in many cases, is a real curse. It's not actually where value lies. In fact, you have a whole discussion about ethical finance, which kind of presumes that finance itself is not ethical, which is probably true. Because if you're only driven by return and you're only driven by return for your shareholders, you don't give a toss about how much it's cost the planet or people. So the most important thing is enabling people like yourselves to have a voice, to actually say, well, what we see is very different. So I'll give you a very simple example. In Taunton, in Somerset, the local authority decided to green a park, plant loads and loads of trees and bushes. And at one level, that was good. It kind of hit their CO2 issues. But they'd never actually talked to anybody about who used that park. And the park was right next door to a big secondary school. And it was a very dangerous place for particularly girls to walk through. A lot of attacks, a lot of people following people. The local co-op store had actually already recognized this and had built a program whereby there was a member of staff on duty if people came in distress. But the planting of extra trees made it even more dangerous. So when the local authority was brought to the park by the children and they said, that area there, that's where they lurk. That's where the bullies are, and you have to give them your money and your phone and so forth. They had to think again about, well, it's all very well to plant trees, but what is actually the need here? So the school then redesigned the park and found spaces which were good for trees, but kept other spaces free, so there was an eye line. Now, it's a very small example, but we tend to assume that, you know, do this and the problem is over. It's much more about what is it that actually is needed. So one of the problems we've had to deal with is that faiths get terribly excited about tree planting. And we had one program in Uganda where our local network, working with the Muslims, we helped create Environment Day in Islam in Uganda. They were planting eucalyptus trees because they grew fast and there was good wood and you could make things out of it. And of course, it's absolutely disastrous for the environment. It absorbs 60% more water than indigenous trees. So it's that listening, it's that hearing, it's doing things collectively. And in the end, and this is the interesting thing with the Green Climate Fund, with their 30 billion a year, they were going into mega schemes which stomped across landscapes and people. We suggested that they try a program of grants to local communities of £3,000 for them to sit down and design what they needed in their own environment. And that has been more successful than anything else. So it's that breaking up, which is why I said to you this morning, you will have ideas, you will have things that could be done, and most of those won't cost a lot of money. And one of the great things about faiths is that we are the largest supporter of civil society in the world. A recent survey in the UK showed that the Methodists, who are not very large, they provide something like £1.5 billion worth of social services per year, free, because they look after the elderly, they set up kindergartens and so forth. So there are other economies that we need to be working with, not just money economies. And that's one of the biggest issues. I mean, I know John is a huge advocate of green economy. I mean, you know, he just thinks you can buy your way out of the crisis, don't you, John? He'll probably say something about that later. He doesn't. And I'm with him 100%. There is no such thing as green growth. It's a myth. It's how we preserve what we've got without having to make any changes. So economics now has to think about how do you sustain where we are and possibly even reduce return in order that the rest of the planet can live. So, don't know if that answers your question, but that's from the heart.
Any other questions? One here, and then I'll come to you. So,
very straight to the point. What can be done to include religious rights to join the environmental conversation?
So you talked about saying how some religious people are joining this crisis of the climate, and there's some governments that are also doing it. But what do we do about the religious people who are opposed to climate change, and yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you. Oh, am I on? Yes, I'm on. That's a very good question. I mean, first of all, what I would say is that they are a tiny, tiny group, but they're very loud. The most helpful explanation of fundamentalist groups is think about a swimming pool. Where does most of the noise come from? The shallow end. Oh, really? Oh, I thought that was very objective. Anyway, so with that caveat, there is also an element, and it's a really interesting one. So when I first started in this work, everyone was saying, oh, the Christian evangelical fundamentalists of America, you know, they're in denial and so on and so forth. And they're coming up with, well, this must be the plan of God, because if you read the book of Revelation, not a good idea, certainly not in the dark. Scary stuff. Banned by the Ethiopian church. They don't use it. And the Greek Orthodox Church only said you could read the book of Revelation after the Muslims had conquered Constantinople. So it's a dangerous book. But in that, there is this sense that everything has to collapse for the Messiah to return. Being attacked by nature. Horrid stuff. Go away. And so there was this thing of, the first time I gave a talk in America, after we'd done the Assisi meeting at a theological college, there were 500 protesters outside claiming that I was a forerunner of the Antichrist. I mean, how disappointing is that? A forerunner, for God's sake. I mean, why couldn't I be the Antichrist? I mean, who wants to be a forerunner? I mean, who really ever hears about John the Baptist? I mean, seriously. So anyway, so there they were protesting. And I said, well, I'll go out and talk to them. So I did go out and talk to them. That didn't work because their understanding of the Bible was so different from an Anglican one, which is, you know, it's a jolly good novel, but frankly, the Book of Common Prayer is a much better book to read. And I realized there was no way I could enter their minds. But what I did realize was that, ironically, they had realized how great the threat was. At that point, when talking 1987, at that point, the vast majority of the world, the vast majority of the development agencies had nothing on the environment. In fact, Christian Aid was opposed to the environment because they thought it was anti-poor. So this group of evangelicals who read their Bible, who looked at the news and interpreted the news through the dramatic script, if you like, of the book of Revelation and the various apocalyptic bits in Matthew and Mark, they actually had seen we were on the sliding path. We were heading towards hell. Their response had been to say, but don't worry, it's all God's plan, and therefore I was thwarting God's plan by trying to stop the environmental degradation. And I knew at that point I could not reach them. I was not in their world. And it would have to come within. And in 1995, an evangelical pastor produced a bumper sticker. You know, Americans basically can think in sentences. So you stick a bumper sticker on them. And this one said, what car would Jesus drive? And for the first time, but from within their own mythology, their own justification, they began to articulate something's not right. And now the evangelical movement in the States is the largest single group within the religions active on the environment, with a nutter wing, and we know how powerful that can be, but a diminishing nutter wing. So it's terribly easy to dismiss people. But the point is we all live in stories, and if you can get inside the story and help them see that's not quite the story they need to tell, and that there is an alternative which they found themselves, that's the way forward. And that goes back to this whole thing of diversity.
I'll let you in now, but just before that, and partly to connect your question, what's interesting about the American evangelical story is that science was involved in it. They did meet with climate scientists to convince them of the reality. But also there was a war for oil way before your time in 2003 called the Iraq War. And the issue was that America going to war in Iraq was costing American lives, and it was a war for oil. And oil is the main thing that's causing the climate crisis. So there was an unhappy coincidence of the science and Americans dying for oil, which led then to the bumper car stickers of what would Jesus drive and so on. And of course he would walk. That was the issue. But our last question here, and then we're going to get you into bigger groups.
What do you think of veganism and vegetarianism, and would you be a vegan or vegetarian?
Oh, am I on?
I should just say your lunch is all plant-based.
Good. Good. Am I on? Yes? Can you hear me? Oh, there we go. Very good question indeed. And I will tell you a little story before I come to this, because it is a big issue, and it should be a big issue. And about 10 years ago, I was asked by Bath Abbey, I live just outside Bath in Somerset, to speak at their harvest supper and then preach on the Sunday morning in the Abbey for harvest. And lots of excitement. I was going to preach twice and do this. I'm not a priest, by the way. I studied theology, but I long ago realized that within 24 hours of vowing obedience to a bishop, I would have broken it. So it just seemed silly to go through the pain. And I began to converse with the Abbey, who's quite a liberal place, about the food for the harvest supper. And I said, so, what's your purchasing policy? And they went, purchasing policy? I think we go to Tesco's. And I go, no. So, are you having meat? Oh, yes. Why? Oh, well, we always do chicken. Why? Well, yes. And I said, and presumably you buy free range. And they went, well, we get it from Tesco. We don't. No, I suppose we could. And what about the milk for the tea? I hadn't thought of butter. Where are your vegetables from? Good question. And I said, what about local? How much are you local? So you're cutting travel costs. They went, oh, well, we've got someone who makes the apple crumble from apples from her own fields. And I went, great. So basically, 90% of what you're doing with the food, you haven't given a moment's thought to in relationship to the theme of the whole weekend. And that's very common. WWF, God bless them, I've worked with them for decades, they didn't have an ethical purchasing policy until 2019. And they were giving people lunches all the time. Hinduism, of course, and much of Buddhism and Taoism have a tradition of vegetarianism. Vegan, not vegetarianism. Vegan is a more recent invention and comes with a lot of evangelical apostles who, make you feel this size if you don't. But those faiths have always had a tradition of vegetarianism. Total within Hinduism and much of Buddhism, though not Mongolian Buddhism, as I discovered when we had a whole group of Mongolian Buddhists came and they headed state for the Angus steak hut. That's because there are no vegetables in Mongolia. But the vast majority, and that's been an enormously important thing for them to maintain and speak about. However, young Indians are seeing meat eating as cool. And so ironically, whereas we are seeing vegetarian and vegan as cool, it's gone the other way. So there's a big program within Hinduism and Buddhism to reach out to them. In Taoism, of course, communist China, one of the largest meat-eating countries in the world now, huge consumption. But we've reintroduced with the Taoists the lunar calendar that on the first day and the 15th day of the lunar month, you don't eat meat. And I'm a vegetarian. And we actually held the first ever vegan royal dinner at Windsor Castle in 2015, where we had religious leaders and political leaders who were doing it with the UN, trying to persuade Prince Philip to eat vegan was probably the biggest single conceptual challenge of my entire life. And when at the end I said to him, so, he went, never again. But I think we we need to be balancing excess versus limitation. So my wife and I went vegan for a while until we realized that to have vegan sausages meant you were eating so much processed food, so many chemicals. There was one point at which I cooked some vegan sausages and left them in the oven and came back, and there was this congealed gunge. So we've taken the position, we do occasionally, we have guests, we do have meat. Sometimes we have a fantastic local butchers who's entirely free range. I'd rather have something that had been alive and had been cared for well than something that was full of processed stuff so that it tasted like it. So I think we're in this cusp between a kind of almost absolutism, you can only do this, over against what can the planet actually bear? And what do our bodies bear? Because the well-being of the planet is also our well-being. So I think it's a complex one, and I don't think it has simple answers.
Great question, Joe.
Yeah.
And as a non-evangelical, Marxist, atheist vegan,
Non-evangelical?
maybe I'm an Anglican, I don't know.
Oh,
I leave you with this way of describing this. There's a reasons why abattoirs don't have glass walls. If people knew the conditions under which the billions of sentient life, and it is in the billions, that die every year, they may think about it. But I think Martin's quite correct. I mean, you can be too dogmatic on this issue. You know, the classic one here, do you buy local or do you buy organic? What is the added advantage of flying in organic apples from New Zealand as opposed to perhaps chemically produced ones here from Armagh? Why would we be bringing in apples from New Zealand anyway? We've got the best apples in the world here in Armagh. But it is an issue, I think, that in all my 30-odd years lecturing, it's the issue that gets students really excited and debating, because it's something we do every day. You all have to eat and so on. And actually, you know, speaking as somebody who doesn't have a faith, I do acknowledge the importance of things like grace and gratitude. We're not thankful enough for the things that we enjoy that many other people in the world don't. But can I ask you all to give Martin a round of applause?
We're now going to ask you to do is, there's blue tack on your table, so we want you to take your poster and we want you to stick it on a window or somewhere around the wall. And then we want everyone to walk round and read what everybody else has on the wall, and to take a marker and to put a tick beside, when you've had a chance to consider them all and walk around the wall, put a tick beside the one priority that you think, it may not be your table's priority, it might be somebody else, the one that you think is most important that we get to the politicians first. It doesn't mean that they're not all going, but the one that you think we should ensure we put to the politicians first. So now we're sort of at a sifting, you know, which one is the priority. So if you go and then chat, you can chat while you go around the wall, and please, the teachers can learn as well, and Martin and John can learn. We're here to learn from you. So we will all go around and have a look and see what you have done, and then the politicians are arriving at 12 o'clock. And then we can decide, you can decide in your groups who will ask if there's questions you want, but we're going to start with the group who will have the most ticks on the sheet as the most important question. Okay, you get it? So the politicians that are coming, just to let you know, I think I'll let you know just in case they do come, we have, three are definitely coming. We have Malachy O'Hara from the Green Party, Senator Malachy O'Hara. We have Jerry Carroll for People Before Profit. We have Claire Hanna from the SDLP. The DUP have their conference today, so they could not attend. I contacted the UUP, Sinn Féin, Alliance Party, TUV. TUV declined. The other parties were interested, but they did not come forward with a name. So they may come, they may not. Now, John Barry has been so bold as to say we should put empty seats up here. So we should have 8 seats, 3 are filled and 5 are empty, just to signal that 5 parties have not come to hear your voices today. And we will decide then as well, we will collect all your sheets and we will ensure that those 5 parties that were not here today will indeed be informed of your discussion and what your thoughts are. So we just have a 15-minute now. The politicians are to arrive at 12. 15 minutes to get your stuff on the wall, walk around, have a quick read, get your ticks on the sheets, and let's go from there. Thanks. Bye. Yeah, each person has a tick. Each person has a tick. Okay. I may need to ask somebody to look at the posters and identify the one that has the most ticks on it when we get to that, because we're going to start with that question. But I want to, first of all, introduce the panel this afternoon, and the panel is as follows. We have, to my extreme right, we have Lesley Veronica, who is the Deputy Leader of the Green Party. I did mention this morning that Senator Malachy O'Hara was coming, but he had been called to Dublin, so I am delighted that Lesley Veronica has been able to step into place. She is the representative for South Antrim, and she has worked in education for over 30 years, and indeed I have met her on many times in the education arena. So we welcome to you today, Lesley. And I'll also introduce the schools to you in a moment. We also have, beside Lesley, we have Claire Hanna, who is soon to become the SDLP leader of the SDLP, member of Social Democratic Labour Party. She is MP for South Belfast and Mid Down, and we are delighted that she has taken time out of her very busy schedule to be here. We're also expecting one other, and in case he comes, I'm going to introduce his name now so that he can just slip in very quietly. We are expecting Jerry Carroll, People Before Profit, and MLA for Belfast West. And if he comes, we'll just slip him in here at the top. So these two ladies don't actually know what we've been at all morning. I mean, they're aware of some of it, but I think they got from the buzz in the room that you're a highly engaged group of people. And I just hope they're up to the job when you start to ask the questions. But we're all in a friendly, we come in peace, everybody comes in peace. So we have identified proposals and questions around the room. So we're going to start. Has anybody identified the poster that has the most ticks on it?
There's about 4 or 5 that have 6 questions. So,
is it hypocritical of politicians to champion environmental action, yet the use of their private jets funded by taxpayer money contributes heavily to carbon emissions? Now, this is more tailored around PM Starmer's use of his private jet, not Claire or yourself, Lesley. Maybe one day, like, but not today. Yeah, if you could answer that, please. Thank you.
Do you want to take the questions first and then answer all together with or do you want to answer one by one? Which one, Martin?
Yeah, we'll get the range.
Get the range. Okay, the next group.
In what way will we get people involved in nature from a young age to give them the will to want to protect it?
Thank you very much. Another question?
If you were to secure more funding, what kind of programmes would you want to lead for the environment?
Thank you. Any others, or will we start with those? One more.
What do each of you plan on doing to help stop the climate change crisis? How will you do it, and how will you fund it?
Thank you. And the last one, we'll take the last one now.
Inspire people through narrative rather than data.
Okay, that's a proposal. Yeah, that's a proposal, yeah. We'll come with that. Okay, thank you. I leave it to you, Martin, at this point.
Great, thank you very much indeed for those. Oh, sorry. Oh, yes, got to use this, and we can't go over this line.
yes, we were going to rush.
I'm sure as politicians you have no problem standing behind the line. So,
please step over the line.
Stop it, you.
Anarchist.
Absolutely. It's the trouble with the teachers today. They're just not dependable, are they? So, I think what I'd like to start you off it's not so much plunging into the personal, because you only travel by private jets. But I like the question about, personally, what would you want to do? What would you really like to see change? And then that very interesting codicil to that, and how would you fund it? What would you have to cut or tax or bring in or stop in order for what you really know needs to be done to be done? Would you like to start first?
Yes, certainly. I'll start with how to fund it. In our last election, in fact, the Green Party of Northern Ireland have had this as a policy for many, many years, I think going back to 2014. How to fund it is to tax the assets of the wealthy. Now, without getting into the details of the difference between the assets and the income, there's a significant difference, and we firmly believe that that is the way forward and that we can generate considerable income. In terms of what needs to be done, there needs to be a wide swathe of activities. We need to stop relying on carbon. That is the #1 thing that we need to do. And in order to do that, we need to turn to sustainable energy forms. We need to look at wind farms. We need to think about heat pumps. They're incredibly expensive. I've just priced one for my own home and nearly had to be scraped off the floor when I heard how expensive it was. We need to have grants for people to be able to get solar panels so that they're not worrying about their energy bills. And the good thing about all this is that at the end of the day, we save money. What we're looking at, we know the winter fuel payment has been rejected by the current government. We know that what that's likely to do is to lead to increased sickness in pensioners this winter. So what you save in one hand, you end up spending on the NHS, which, as we also know, is crumbling. So how do we fund it is a very good question. We do need to think about that, and we must fund it. Realistically, there will have to be taxation, but we think that burden of tax needs to go to the wealthiest 1%.
Can I just ask you to dig a little bit deeper, Lesley? So you say go to the alternative energy sources. Would you do that primarily through private enterprise? Would you do that through government schemes? How do you release the land? What's the relationship between, is it the role of government and the role of the private sector, or indeed individuals?
Well, I think it's probably a role of both the government and private sector working hand in hand, which is how we work for the most part. I think in terms of behind the scenes, I've got to say, I've had meetings, say, for example, with the Northern Ireland Electricity. Like, we know that they are trying to do this already. We know that it's not that they're blind to this. It's that our infrastructure in Northern Ireland is so far behind, not only the rest of the UK, but also the Republic of Ireland. So it's very difficult for them to do. And we've had meetings where they have said, listen, we're very keen to look at hydropower. We're very keen to look at wind power because we're perfectly situated for that. But here we have an issue in that we don't have the infrastructure. So until we get the infrastructure, we have to keep using gas and other sources of power, which keeps us, because we are actually lagging behind the rest of these islands as a whole in terms of Britain and Ireland when it comes to these issues.
Lovely, thank you. So, Claire.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick up. We were told we have to hold these in case you think we're trying to be really cool. This is what we were told. This is how these microphones work. But yet, to pick up on that, because I don't disagree really with any of that. Yes, and Leslie's absolutely right around taxing assets rather than work. Really, you can either tax people's work or you can tax things, but there are people who are making more money than any of us are in a year just by owning stuff, probably stuff that they've owned for generations and generations, and there is a lot of injustice in that and a lot of money that can be raised. And there's also a lot of money in the profits of particularly energy companies. We're talking about a £22 billion black hole in the public finances. Well, if you add up the profits of BP and others just in the UK, it's twice that. You know, so there are opportunities to levy it where the most damage is being done. At the moment, people are struggling a bit, so it's hard to put it on people's home heating or whatever, particularly when they're in inefficient homes. But there are obvious places to raise some of the capital to help us adapt our transport systems. In terms of getting more energy, we are not short of wind in this part of the world, and that's not just politicians. That's out on the land as well. And it's kind of logistical challenges that are stopping us from doing it. Rarely, we actually have a scenario where there's lots of people who want to invest in it because there is money to be made as well. But it's things like planning issues. We've done a lot of work through the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, which is a parliamentary select committee I sit on, and some good ideas around, for example, giving some benefits to the host community. So in years gone by, people go, I don't want that wind turbine, you know, out above my house. Maybe if we go, well, look, your energy bill can be reduced, you know, just by having the infrastructure in your area, we can make it directly benefit you as well as benefiting the planet. But I suppose to go back to the question about how we inspire young people, I suppose it is at a very early age, just helping people to understand the connection between our actions and the world we live in. And I think young people, I know as a mum of 3, are uniquely receptive to that. They just get it you know, particularly at a small age, younger than all of us in this room. And in that way, I think people will understand the gains and the stretches and the changes we all have to make in our lives.
We'll come back to that question about the young again in a moment. The group that asked the question about the personal choice and the funding, could somebody from that group, is this enough of an answer? Oh yes, can we have a mic down here, right down here?
While you do that, I'm happy to come back in. I am somebody who, long before I was in politics full-time, did work on environmental issues. I worked for an aid agency for 10 years, and a lot of our focus was on climate change and supporting people around the world who are impacted about it. So I do have some moral challenges with the fact that I commute by aircraft. I fly to London most weeks, and I explored other ways of doing it, and there are, you know, I to the best of my ability, if I have to go to Brussels or whatever, I go on the train. So there are some logistical challenges for politicians. There's also at the moment a lot in the news about politicians taking gifts and all that. You can absolutely get rid of that, but sometimes logistically there are choices to be made about transport.
Question in one question. We'll come
Just
back to
while
that.
we were getting a mic.
Come on, please give us a...
I just wanted to ask, you were talking about how, well, both of you were talking about how you would tax the assets of the rich. First of all, I'd ask, how would you do that? Really just go into depth on how you would do that exactly, and explain for everybody else and myself, why are people not doing that already? If it would be just as easy as taxing the assets of the rich, taxing BP, taxing all these people to get far more money into our economy, why is it not being done?
Can I ask? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
First of all, it's not being done because I think a lot of politicians are afraid of it. They see it as highly controversial. I mean, the idea of taxation at all, it has become a very dominant view in Britain and Ireland that that's a negative. You know, we've nearly gone down, I don't know, the American model, where taxation is an evil that should be avoided. And I think for the big political parties, it's challenging for them to take up on that. Now, we know from research that was done last year that 78% of the British public actually support the idea. So it's one of those areas where you think these big parties are maybe a bit out of kilter. Now, there's no way as the Conservative Party ever going to say we support taxing the assets. Like, they would collapse within 24 hours. What is more interesting is the Labour Party, for example. So we've got a Labour Party government at the minute, but we've got a Labour Party that is moved to the right, and that has stuck to that, as we've seen with this, a couple of things that have come out, the winter fuel one being one of it. So it's very, very against, like, this Labour Party is marketing itself on being nearly a centre-right rather than a centre-left. You know, they're very much very, very conservative on these social policies, and it's fear. It's fear of a backlash. It's fear of how people will react. There's a really good group which are millionaires who are in favour of this. They are the group behind it, and I would encourage any of you, especially if you're studying economics, to look up Gary's Economics on YouTube, and he's very good, far better at explaining this than I am, right? But it was actually through watching him that I really thought, oh yeah, this really can work. Because I think it's drilled into all of us, even if you sort of are open to these ideas. We all have grown up in a system where it is drilled into us. The ideology that we live in is an ideology which believes that taxation is wrong and it'll put people off and it'll do this, that and the other. And I think it also is important to say that we are talking about people who are incredibly wealthy. Like, we are not, people get fearful. Like, when I would say this going around canvassing, for example, people would be like, well, what does that mean? Like, am I going to suddenly... And it's like, no, none of us are going to be affected by this, perhaps in a better way, but we are not going to be impacted by this. The system that is used currently, the Spanish government do this. The French government were doing it and they changed their system, but they're going to move back again. So it is happening in other places. So it is something that I think there's maybe growing support for across Europe, because of course all of Europe is suffering. One of the impacts, I think, and not to get too off on a tangent, is that because of austerity, because of cuts in public services, because people are suffering, they're starting to lose faith in democracy. They're turning to anti-democratic ideas. Like, to me, investment in public services and in people is so important to maintain democracy as well, and to stop people being, dare I say, brainwashed by some of that really extreme right-wing stuff that we're seeing rising right across Europe. But people are turning to that because they're looking at the system and saying the system doesn't work. And then they're jumping to what seems like a logical conclusion. Either they're blaming the wrong people for why the system doesn't work, or they're saying, oh, democracy doesn't work. But actually, it's about our economic system. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Tying those together very perfectly. Claire.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that sometimes it can be a bit simplistic. We'll just eat the rich and that'll solve everything. But it is not just necessary and possible. It is actually approaching. If you look at things like the Apple tax judgment in the Republic and a lot of the legal moves around that, it's because the zeitgeist of just low tax is over. The world is moving to a stage of understanding that corporations, particularly, rapacious corporations who are damaging the planet and, I suppose, underselling workers, are no longer good for us. Just look at the hoarding of wealth that goes on. The figures attached to companies like Amazon, just sums that we can't even process in our minds, and I suppose just creating a complete disparity. For what it's worth, I don't think governments aren't doing it. It's easy to say, oh, they're getting bungs, or it's about their donors, or they don't want to annoy people. I think there's some elements of that in terms of your understanding and your worldview, and your sense of whether or not people should be allowed to just keep whatever they earn. But I think a lot of it is about, because it's in some ways easier to just let those companies do that and keep the jobs here. Governments are worried about, capital flight, about businesses who say, well, if you're going to tax me, I'm going to go somewhere else. And that lets them off the hook. If you look in the Republic, it isn't just, and people here got a bit obsessed, that corporation tax, lowering it is going to solve our problems. If you look at the Republic, the investment isn't happening there just because they've got low corporation tax. It's because they've invested in education. It's because they've invested in infrastructure. It's because it's a fairly open and dynamic economy. Now, don't get me wrong, they haven't spent that tax revenue properly, but it's understanding the reasons that people make investments in a country, and it's not all about just low tax. It's also understanding that a lot of the income that businesses are enjoying is windfall. It is, for example, I use Amazon, the change in how we all shop and acquire things was dramatic, particularly in COVID, but they pay less tax than the wee shop across the road there who is trying to contribute to the community, who's preventing high streets from going derelict. So it's about rebalancing it. I grew up on the Lisburn Road. If anybody knows, I know some of the schools are local, Arcadia Delicatessen pays more rates than the big Tesco on the Lisburn Road. Sometimes we just levy the taxes in the wrong way, and if you look at the amount of wealth that is being accrued to the very top individuals and companies, I just don't think you can possibly say it's just, or it's sustainable, or it's making the world work. And the fact is, people at the lower end of the income scale, when they have money, they'll spend it, they'll put it back into the economy, it'll create jobs. When people at the top end have it, it tends to go into ISAs and things like that, and it goes into saving, and it doesn't circulate, and it doesn't create work for other people.
Can I pick up on what you were mentioning earlier, that you work for a development agency?
I don't, I'm an MP, but I used to.
Yep. This issue of engaging the young, I mean, the danger always at events like this is we patronise and we go, you're the future and all the rest of it, blah, blah.
Let's stop you.
It's very difficult to do the kind of things you were suggesting, Lesley, of changing an understanding that's so deep embedded that the idea of tax is kind of slightly something you try and dodge or go round and so forth, or that actually it's all so vast it can't be, what can we do to tackle it? to both of you, but starting with you, Claire, what has worked in terms of helping young people escape the mindset that they have inherited?
Well, I think in general, it's not the young people. It's not the young people who are the problem, in my experience. You know, it's not. I think it's not people of this generation or even mine or the ones below me that are probably where the challenge is. I think people are a little bit more plugged into, I suppose, an understanding of things like the environment, of things like social justice. Part of the difficulty, I suppose, is weaving all of that into a coherent plan rather than people just going, well, I back this campaign or I back this particular ask or I like this particular policy. Sometimes it is difficult to stomach the fact that sometimes you make easy decisions and sometimes you make difficult decisions, and sometimes if you're going to do political parties are about weaving together the interests of different parts of the community, different parts of the economy, and sometimes there's going to be decisions in that aren't going to seem completely in tune with what you're trying to do. So I suppose one of the things is preparing all of us for some degree of compromise, and politics is about, as I say, reconciling those interests, the interests of young people, the interests of old people, the interests of people who are you know, setting up businesses, the interests of people who are working for them. So, I mean, what works, I suppose, is concepts of social solidarity. I think people are inspired and affected by the stories of people that are, I suppose, bearing the brunt of some of our decisions. That's what I've found has worked.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, young people themselves, like today, I think we can see that a lot of the environmental movement, for example, has been organised and led by young people. And I'm thinking, obviously, Greta Thunberg, everybody, do you know what I mean? And she is inspirational, but also Extinction Rebellion and movements like that. And I think we make the mistake of thinking that each generation is exactly the same as the generation before. Of course, we're impacted. One of my areas is legacy and intergenerational impact of the conflict, and there's all sorts of sneaky ways that gets passed down rather than the very direct ways. So I do get that there is that element. So for each generation, I think there's an element of the past generation that we can't escape because we've been raised in particular households and particular cultures and gone to particular schools. But we've also got things that are unique to us because we are not being raised in the exact same time space. So for you, you are proper digital nomads. You are completely immersed in the digital world. That is because of the time that you were born and the way that your whole life experience has been. Whereas for me, I mean, it's still, my youngest is 15 and he still thinks it cracked him up entirely for me to talk about the days before the internet, right? To talk about whenever I was here as an undergrad, having to go to the library and read books, and studying politics, it was a nightmare because there was no social media. Now I just think it's so much easier, you know. So I think that whenever we're looking at young people, your experience of the world, the way that you live in the world is already different, and that's going to mean that your reaction to the world is different. In my experience, some of the most radical ideas are coming from young people because of the understanding that you've been dealt a raw hand over the last 14 years. You really have. One of the things that's problematic is this tendency for young people not to vote, which allows political parties to ignore young people as a voting group. Now, I'm talking not so much here, to be honest. I'm talking more about in the wider UK, right? But whenever you do that as a group, whenever you take yourself out of those voting statistics, it means that if a government wants to have a big headline, we're going to save money, then the easy group to target's the one that's you're not going to lose a vote from. So it's easy for them to go, all right, well, do you know what we'll do? We'll make it so that you can't get your benefits until you're this age. And then we'll make it even harder. Do you know? And that's the way it goes along. And what you end up with is a situation which we're in now, where young people are looking at the world as it is. I stood, the last school that I taught in schools, and then I taught in Belfast Met for years, A-level politics all the time. And I remember the last speech day, do you know, whenever people get in, these sort of experts who do this lovely speech, and I was on the stage with staff, trying to keep my face straight. Botox hadn't been invented in those days, so I didn't even have the artificial hope. But this guy got up, and he was talking about, we're entering a new era, an era of 0 hours contracts, and isn't this marvellous? And I felt like kicking him off the stage. I was was like, are we listening to this? This is a disaster. And here you're living in it. You're living in that. That's your reality. So it should be no surprise that you think differently about the world. It should be no surprise that you're able to look, and when you hear reports, like here's the thing, 10 years ago we were talking about climate change, and Claire would have been the same. And at that time, there was maybe more people were like, they're exaggerating. But now, and there are still, some people have got to say knock a door sometimes and say it's a scam. So there are still people who are climate change deniers, right? I do think they're shrinking, but there are. But now we are not talking about when the climate starts to change. We're living in it. We're living in it, and we can all see it. We can see the impact. You're also seeing the impact of particular types of economic and political decisions on what sort of lives you're going to have. It's very different to my life. The guys coming in here today came to Queen's to do my degree in 1986, which just gives you an idea of how ancient I am. But I was one of the last years to get a grant. Now, I grew up in a housing estate in South Belfast, Benmore Estate, that's where I grew up. And I can tell you point blank, and I was thinking that as I was driving in today, I would not have come to Queen's if I didn't get a grant. Because I came from such a poor working class background, I'd have been terrified of debt. And when I think of that, and then I go on, I become a teacher, senior examiner at SEA, you know, all of those things. I'm sure I would have had a very good life, but it wouldn't have been that life. And the other side of that is you're also being conditioned for a life of debt. So when I'm talking about taxing the assets that these people have, they're getting of financing other people's debt. But they need us to be in debt to get those assets. So you leave university with a load of debt. What's happened there is you've got used to the idea of being in debt, which is not something you want to do. You know, you really don't.
Can I throw it open? I mean, thank you. I mean, that was really helpful. What do you feel? Does this reflect what you feel? Is this something that you feel you have some agency over? This question of your own engagement and the world that is out there, which, you know, Lesley has painted very starkly but very clearly. What sense? Yes, at the back, if we can pass.
Can I go? How feasible do you think a high tax on the assets of the very rich, the top 1% or whatever, how feasible do you think that is in the current political climate, like within the next decade or so, that we'd have that taxation to a reasonable extent that it would have the benefits that we all hope for?
Let's take the other. There's another question, someone?
Specifically, Claire, how are you going to tell Keir Starmer, basically, what ways are you proposing that large corporations, stopping them from getting through loopholes, basically, in the taxation system? How are you going to propose that?
Thank you. Could you... Oh, is there one more? Sorry.
You mentioned Extinction Rebellion, and do you think that the protests that they do and other things like Just Stop Oil, do you think their protests that they do are effective, or do you think that they disillusion people more than they do inspire?
Thank you. We'll hold it at that. Three very good questions indeed. I think Claire, Lesley, could we start with you on this one and then come to Claire, because you kind of set the, well, you both did, but let's see where these three sort of reflections.
Yeah. I'll start with, because that's fresher in my mind, Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion. I think it depends what we think of the purpose of protest as being. And there are two purposes in my mind. Now, we can further divide that, but let's stick to two for the sake of time. So the first purpose is the one that we all think of, to get policy change, right? That's obviously what any pressure group wants to do. They want to get policy change. And the second one, though, is less talked about, and that is an empowerment, a vehicle of empowerment for the people who take part in those protests. I myself have taken part in numerous protests where I felt like the chance of this change in anybody's mind on anything is minimal, right? Where I knew that, where I was given up time to go and do it, but it was that, and I know it sounds hopelessly romantic, right, but it was that stand up and be counted moment. It was like, I don't care, well, I do care, but I am willing to invest the time doing this thing just so that I feel like I have said, I don't support this, and that's it. And like one of the clearest examples was the Iraq War, when 1 million people come out, and sure, we went to war anyway. Do you know? So that's a really good example. I know what you mean, though. There is a tendency, I think, within Britain, different cultures, different political cultures react to protest differently. Like, I think it's become quite mainstream for us all to regard the French as like, you know, something has happened. They've raised the postage stamp by, you know, not even 1 cent, never mind €1. We can expect everybody, including pensioners, out burning buses. Like, that's the way we see that culture. Whereas I think there's not a culture of really liking protest, but at the same time, protest can be very effective. I think there's a mixed reaction to it, to be honest. I mean, you see a backlash against some of the things that happen. If it's about raising awareness and getting in the news, but there's always that double-edged sword with that type of protest. You're quite right, because I think we are, again, hardwired in Britain to think of it as a negative, really, on the whole. But then protest is protest. Like, what's the nice way of doing it? And do you get listened to if you do it the nice way? Do you know what I mean?
Okay, Claire, do you want to just pick up on that
Sure,
one? Let's
sure.
kind of back them around.
Yeah, and absolutely they are. It is, if it was as simple as just levying it, but the fact is, if you look back to last year at the Truss quartering thing, governments can do it. They can take the money out of the economy fairly quickly, so they can put it back in as well. And obviously the markets reacted because the UK was suddenly proposing to lose a lot of revenue, and that's why it went badly. But it is possible to do it, and it is possible to be bold, and that's part of what we will be trying to be doing in this Parliament. And I've worked with, you know, various parts of the Labour Party and the Green Party very much in the last mandate and this one coming to push some of those ideas, to push them, I suppose, to move, as I say, the Overton window, to push them from being out there to being on an order paper in the UK Parliament, to kind of being a bit more real in people's minds. And that's how change happens as well, sometimes in those boring ways. No doubt tax is complicated, and the very wealthiest will have lots of people employed to tax plan to help them avoid paying it. Some of it is going to be about international regulation as well, and kind of mapping and monitoring the flow and people's money being moved around the world to avoid taxation, and keeping an eye out on exploitation happening in poorer countries. But it is possible, even things like on pay, particularly with big employers, because at the moment we're all subsidising big companies paying their staff low wages that you can't live on, so they have to be paid tax credits and other benefits out of the public purse. So actually, we're not just not taking it off them, we're giving it back to them.
Energy to change this.
Yeah.
How useful are the kind of protests?
So
are they an irritant for you? I mean, not you personally, but in terms of the political, I'm sure, in terms of the political system, are they flies to be squatted, or are they actually? Do they actually have any impact on
it's somewhere
policy?
in between, because you do have to catch people's attention, and that's increasingly difficult. I know even you're making a video or something 4 years ago, you'd go, right, 3 minutes. You have 3 seconds now to grab people's interest. So sometimes I think it is a bit misdirected. Some of the ones, for example, attacking the trains, you're like, this is like ordinary Joe going to work, you know, do kind of get into, and even some of the things about paintings and all that, although I think they didn't, you know, they made sure the paintings were covered with glass, and some of those things, they caught attention, but I think people did find them irritating, and I think you can be better at targeting it, I suppose, to make a point, to help people, I suppose, flip a switch and go, actually, this is where the damage is being done. What I do think was unjust in the context of the sentences people receive for other crimes is people going to jail for 5 years for that, and the kind of the life that spins off for somebody who was motivated clearly by the greater good, you know. And when you look at some of the crimes, even in the week just past, and the sentences that people get, I think it is unjust. But I can understand the irritation, but it's kind of dog eat dog in the attention economy in some ways.
Fair enough. And so, Lesley, just going back to the question about how feasible is it to do this taxing, and you've cited I think Spain and France going back. Not only how feasible is it to do it here, but you touched on this as well, Claire, the fact that we should be looking at international legislation and so forth. So take us into that journey of what really works, why it works, where the models are, and between the two of you, what's the sense of the next epoch in this kind of approach, away from just purely a national or even a local response? Sorry, that's rather a lot, but
No, it's fine. And I did want to come back on that because I think it is feasible, it is doable, and in fact, in terms of the climate crisis, it's necessary. One of the problems that we have, we know what the solutions are. I often think, and it's some of the things I'm trying to do with the Green Party, is it can be very doom and gloom. It can be, this is awful, we're going off a cliff edge, humanity's not going to be able to live on this planet anymore, we've ruined everything. It can be all like that. But the point is, we know what to do to try to bring it back from the brink. We know what to do, and it's like that difference between, is it an opportunity or a threat? It's both. But there is an opportunity here, because I think what has happened is, it's like our natural environment has stood up and said to us all, the way that you have been living is wrong. This is not any longer sustainable. So this way that we have been living, particularly in the West, which is dominated by the whole ideas of capitalism and profit motive and all of that, and centred on the idea that somehow we're individuals amongst ourselves. It denies our connectivity as human beings, but it denies our connectivity to nature, and that we are really having to face up to the fact that that model of thinking is no longer serving us if we want to survive as a species, and it is to survive as a species. Like, often we talk about the planet, we're going to kill the planet, save the planet. It's save the planet to the extent that we can still live on it. The planet will not die. The planet will change. We'll die. We'll not be able to live on it anymore. It will become uninhabitable for us, which for the rest of the planet might be a good thing, to be quite honest. But it's not that the planet's going to die. The planet will merge into something new and different and survive. But we'll go. So to me, the problem there is, right, if we've got this immediate problem, which we do, we are now seeing the dates coming back every year. Science is telling us now 2030s. So we need to take drastic action. That requires money. So we need to be brave about where that money has to come from. We have to be able to access money to bring those changes in whatever way we can.
Yeah, some of it is about communicating the upsides as well, rather than just going, we're all going to be on fire, and that's the motivation to change. Say, well, look, if we put, say, sustainable transport infrastructure, you can cycle here and you'll have a more chill 10 minutes on your way to the meeting than battling traffic or whatever. It's explaining the positives to people as well. Some of the stuff around, there's a lot of thinking being done around food systems and how what we eat gets here. And I suppose just people can get that food that's locally grown tastes better than something that's been, in transit 2,000 miles or whatever. Frozen chips aren't bad. I must say there's some good ones. No, but so I suppose trying to communicate the positives to people as well, and then some of it is going to be about better explaining and going back to tax. And there's no point in us pretending that you can flip a switch. Or by the way, I did say I've had a busy week. It's not going to be really heavy on policy. You did just ask me to explain international tax systems, so I wasn't ready for that today. But that it's going to be simple. But some of it is about, I suppose, if people feel that life is going to improve, they will be more inclined to opt in. And maybe if we are saying this is a levy that is about getting our energy systems into place, and they've tried to do a wee bit of that. I'm guessing none of you are paying your rates bill, but if you open it up, it does have a little bit of a pie chart on the back about the different things that it's being spent on. And I suppose getting all of us to understand that tax isn't just some brute taking X% of your wages every month, that it's going back in. And I suppose getting people to understand that those big companies didn't do that all on their own. They're using the roads that we're all paying for. Their staff are educated in the schools that we're all paying for, and just getting people to understand, I suppose, the circle of life.
Thank you both very much on that. Another question was this one. Oh, sorry, what?
Yes, please. I want to hear.
Oh, sorry.
Hiya, sorry. This is a question for the two of you over there. So you talk about how tax is, taxing the wealthy is a very, you could do it, like it's what's the word? It's yeah, it's a feasible solution. It's something that you can do and implement. But then you also said that there's a lot of stigma and there's a lot of fear around taxation. And on its own, taxing the ultra-rich, taxing that 1% is a fairly socialist policy. So in the sense that obviously the Conservative government, the likes of even, say, the DUP or places, political parties here wouldn't be for taxing that 1% or even the 10%. My question is sort of, how will you break that stigma of, the fear behind socialism and socialist policies? Because when people think of socialism and socialist policies of taxing the rich, you automatically think the extreme far left. And I don't think it's for big businesses and sort of oil companies that should be taxed. I don't think it's a fear of a lack of, say, support from the government. It's a fear of left-wing politics. It's as simple as that.
Thank you.
But thank you.
Can I ask you to broaden that question out? Because you talked about the problem is often that we present a narrative of doom and gloom. And that's something that I've fought all my life in this movement, and I work a lot at the UN and others like that. And I have to keep pointing out to them, nobody reads their reports, nobody reads the data. We're not converted by pie charts. We're converted by narratives, by stories. Yeah. How do we change the narrative? And what narratives have you found that have helped you to move from a position to where you are now? And in a sense, one of the narratives is that, taxing people is somehow an infringement on their rights. Yeah. So we've got a mythological series of narratives that we need to address, and they have to be addressed by narratives. Partially answer that question, partially, what stories changed and moved you, both?
If I come back to that, I agree with you. It's really interesting. I think that we're in an era of maybe needing a redefinition of what is socialism in a way. Because, I certainly grew up at a time whenever I was becoming very politically conscious and politically aware in the 1980s. And the 1980s here, as you may imagine, was a very interesting time. We were in the absolute heart of conflict. We had a number of really big events going on. But actually, one of the things that stood out to me, and I still remember writing about it in my O-level, English exam was the miners' strike in England. And that was a real defining moment for me. It was from then on that I was really became immersed in politics, both locally and wider afield. So in terms of this idea, that the idea these are socialist policies, it can be very easily harnessed, and they are. Do you know what I mean? There's no doubt that that fits down that line, right? But it can be harnessed by those who are against it as a way of dismissing these policies. And that's where we have to be careful, because again, in a culture that has become dominated by neoliberal ideas, really, then it becomes a byword for, naive, or, this is the way that it becomes seen. So I think that, back to what Martin was saying about, what narrative, we do need narratives. This is the way that we move forward. So for somebody like myself who would be instinctively in favour of that policy, I needed to go away and have a think and listen to people who knew much more. I'm not from the sort of background where you know about investing. Right? That is not something I would ever have known anything about. I never would have had the money to even worry about investing. And do you know what I mean? But it was only by starting. So my way around this was actually I had to learn what investing was and how investing worked. And it became clear to me when I was doing that wee bit of self-education that there's just a whole language to do with finance in the world that the vast majority of us don't know exists, right? We just don't know it's there. So, for example, just as one example, people who are investing in ISAs, you start investing in ISA. Let's say you've got £1,000 a month spare, just like we all have, right? You've got £1,000 a month spare, you put it in an ISA, every month, every year for 20 years, you're a millionaire at the end. You've invested about 300,000, you're a millionaire at the end. That's how it works. Because it's compound interest. Did I know anything about that? You have got to be joking. The only O-level I just about got was maths. So But one of the other myths that we have, what we're very, very big on, is this idea of the self-made person. Right? We are very big on the self-made person. And Claire hit upon it there really well. There's no such thing as a self-made person. Right? Even here, sometimes I'll get into rows with people about private healthcare and public healthcare. And they'll be like, oh, no, private healthcare is the way to go. We need to get private healthcare. And I'm like, you are speaking from a position of privilege. And the privilege you're in is not the privilege of being able to afford private healthcare. It's the privilege of having a really good public healthcare system to fall back on whenever your insurance company says, no, we're not going to pay for that. So the idea that any of us is totally self-made, because I think a lot of this negativity around tax and taxing the very wealthy comes from that first place, that these people are lauded as this is what we all want to be like. But we need to deconstruct that. We need to think about who are all the individuals along the way that help that person. Like I can specifically mention individuals along my own path who wouldn't even, probably some of them were people that I knew for years, others were people that were a moment in my life and who said the right thing at the right time on the right day, and I kept going on a path that I wanted to go on. So I was very lucky. Like I told you, I got a grant to go to university. I got a scholarship to go to a particular school. And I also always loved studying. I was a complete nerd. So like there was a bit of that as well. But it was just keep going. So we need to dismantle some of those myths and then bring in more knowledge about how things actually work.
Yeah, I mean,
quickly,
sure, because for better or worse, here in this region, we don't really have tax raising powers. We're a bit on rates, and we can come on that. And I say, as a practicing social democrat, that is challenging because our politics hasn't been about the allocation of resources and who can pay and who should pay and what we want to focus on in the economy. We know it has been about other things, and that's when it's been working. And it is very, very difficult to get that conversation going, particularly here, because in most normal countries, you know, like if a government do something terrible or they just stop showing up for work for 2 years, you know, the tax revenue will drop and they won't be able to do the things they want because of the way our system is, the kind of check. And it does keep shrinking, but the check keeps coming from London. So government can stop, start, do good things, do bad things, and it doesn't really impact. So that does make it challenging, and it makes it harder to have that conversation about the social contract and about the bits that we all need to do and the help that we all need to have. But I think people see a natural justice sometimes. They go, well, why is it that, you know, Elon Musk is going to space and people are starving to death or whatever? So I think there is a bit of that, but it is corrupted a wee bit in some of the media narratives when quite often people will be told that it's because of, you know, that migrant coming over on a boat that you can't get a health appointment rather than some of the other interests that are... I
told you there, Claire, because what we've also asked our audience to do earlier, not just questions, but actual proposals, things they would like to see done. And I don't want you to respond to them because you might then have to write it into your next manifesto, and we'll hope that you will. But what do we have in terms of actual proposals, not the questions? What is it that you felt you would want to do or could be done?
We've decided that we thought it was very important to inspire people through narrative rather than through data, as was mentioned.
I touched on this earlier in my question, but our proposal is substantial taxation of polluters and fossil fuel-related companies in the United Kingdom.
We were proposing ethical laws for businesses. So if they produce a certain amount of emissions, then you start taxing them more and more.
Our proposal was working with the churches in the society to create education programs for children in schools on climate justice.
We had proposed better communication with people, so like the citizens in Northern Ireland better communicating what we want with our government, and then our government passing it on to the likes of, you know, the UK Parliament and vice versa, just working better together.
It was just sort of educate people from like a younger years in school and stuff like that, but also we sort of touched on building on brownfield sites rather than like destroying green spaces, and maybe just like having more like general green space in actual cities rather than just outside. You have the odd parks and stuff, but actual in the city, that nature in the city. And we sort of said about also trees and having more just general more nature, because it could bring more like awareness as well of climate change, because I feel like a big issue is people don't understand, and that's if people don't understand, they're not actually going to care. So I feel like that's important.
And it's better for our mental health.
Very much so. No, thank you very much indeed on that. Now, this may be slightly difficult, but problem often is, when we're speakers, is we appear to be paragons of virtue and not have any clay feet or anything like that. Now, Claire, you've already admitted that you are slightly unhappy about having to commute by plane. So could we take it that that is something that you do, that you really know you ought to try and address, but at the moment it's not possible, but you know it should?
Well, if one of you could invent teleporting or something, then...
Okay. Lesley, what is the thing you do at the moment that you know you should give up for the betterment of the planet?
I think, and it's something that I have actually been addressing quite a lot, is over-consumption of fashion. Let's just get right down to brass tacks. I believe very strongly in the circular economy. This is me trying to justify it. So everything that I don't use goes back to somebody or goes back to eBay, but there's still too much of it. Do you know, there really is.
Okay,
so,
that's
yeah.
lovely. So if you feel that you haven't got it all sorted, you're not alone. That's the heart. These are human beings.
I think that's really important to say. We can't put it all. Absolutely, we all need to make changes in our lives, big changes in our lives. I have a bit of an Amazon habit as well, but but we can't put it all. We do have to do it at a systematic level. There's a danger in saying to people, well, you have to do this and you have to do that and you have to radically change. If the systems aren't there, then it just makes people feel hopeless and guilty, and that doesn't get change.
Absolutely so. One of the lines, I run FaithInvest, we're working with the Faith investment portfolios, and one of our lines is, we know what you're against, because religions are very good at being against things. What are you actually for? So, ladies and gentlemen, can we give a huge hand to two very brave souls?
Of thanks. I mean, I think we're all up for our lunch now. That's one thing I think we're all for at the moment. But a very big thanks to everybody who participated today and for everybody who organised the day. I start with you, the young people. Thank you for your contribution today. Without you, today could not have taken place. Without your ideas and your interaction and your energy, you give us the energy. And thank you very much for that. So a big hand to yourselves, first of all. Secondly, I would like to thank the speakers, Lesley Veronica, well, the speakers, I suppose, Martin Palmer, first of all, who's come from England and who's shared his knowledge of world faiths and his insights, which very, very few people have with us today. Thank you, Martin, for coming. Thank you also to John Barry for his participation today and for Queen's for hosting the event. Thank you to our technical support here today, who actually made the room beautiful in terms of the layout. It looked very professional, and then when we came in, we sort of wrecked it. So it didn't look that good. Not you pupils, but us the adults, sort of wrecked it. But thank you very much for that. I thank also Join the Dots team who are here today. And Join the Dots team are a variety of groups who have come together to explore how faiths together can influence and can affect change, and with the risk of missing some of these groups out, but I'm going to try to name them anyway. We have the University of Ulster chaplaincy team here, Father Jerry and Cheryl Meban. We have Colm down there from the Young Redemptorists. We have Juanita from Focolore. We have Bertie Sterling from Arusha. Beside Bertie there is, Edwin Graham from the Baha'i Faith and also from Interfaith Forum, and Juanita, Ed from the Clonard Youth Ministries. We also have the AFATA team here, AFATA Laudato Si, who've done a lot of work around education in this area. Is there anybody I have left out of that group, Juanita? YouthLink, and representatives from YouthLink, and we will continue to push this area. And also, I want you to leave all your posters in place, because we're going to capture all those ideas, and I'm going to find some way of sending these ideas to the 5 groups of 5 parties who are not here today. And a very big thank you to Lesley, Veronica and Claire. It's not easy to do what they've done today, but thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.